When Beth invited me to come here, I thought I was going to be talking to like 20 people instead of 120. So it's come as a bit of a surprise to me. A lot of the talk today, I guess, will overlap in various aspects, and I'm sure mine will overlap with various other people. Title is Reality, Aspirations in the Wider Context, and English as a Language of Instruction. The first points are pretty obvious. I think it's quite clear that the role of English in development is profoundly uncertain. And one of the reasons for it being uncertain, it's not really sensible to make huge generalizations across countries as varied as India, Nigeria, Malawi, Yemen, or so on. English plays hugely different roles in these various complex societies and even at the local level within these countries. But nevertheless, there is clearly a profound tension between what applied linguists are saying, where they're saying, using English as a medium of instruction. I'm talking particularly in this talk about sub-Saharan Africa, is impairing the quality of education, therefore holding back development. Essentially, that is the applied linguistic thesis. And some development experts, a lot of government officials who say, well, we need English for economic competitiveness, globalization, entrance to the knowledge economy. So on the face of it, there is an impasse, a tension between these two constituencies. Jumping on. Just a brief word about education and development. Kenneth King and his friends at Edinburgh, who I've talked to over the years, regard, in line with human capital formation theory, education in general, as facilitating development. But they would add that this is only potential, and that potential can be thwarted by a whole host of factors, such that education has diminished impact on development. Thwarting contextual factors may include things like poor governance. We all know about textbooks that are distributed from some central depot in Lusaka or somewhere and never arrive at the schools. The money goes into some governor's pocket. That's a rather sensational example, but that would be what we mean by poor governance or weak institutional capacity. Stagnant macroeconomic environments thwart the impact of education. What is the use of having developed literacy in a language if there are very few literacy materials in that language, if there is a lack of a literacy environment? And finally, and what I'm really going to talk about, is low quality education. Education cannot improve development if it's of very low quality. So let's talk about that. Now, I agree that there is a substantial body of evidence showing that in a range of sub-Saharan African countries, performance of pupils in English medium education is weak. And the remedy suggested is to allocate a much greater role for local languages, particularly in primary school, but also in secondary school. And this, it is argued quite persuasively, I think, will lead to improved classroom interaction, a better kind of pedagogical discourse, to better understanding of what is being said by the teacher, and a greater fairness in accessing education, particularly on the part of poor people who live in rural areas. I think the arguments here are very persuasive, and I'm not really going to cast aspersions on them at the moment. But what I'm going to talk about is the wider context, and particularly to argue that local language media are not necessarily a panacea which will solve all these problems, or even many of them. As I said, the empirical and theoretical case for greater role for local languages is very strong and probably unassailable as regards primary education. Not necessarily so for secondary education, but it's not entirely unproblematic, as I will try and argue. So we need to consider the wider context, sociolinguistic, economic, political, and attitudinal, when we think about the solutions to a very real problem, which is the exaggerated use of English in education in sub-Saharan Africa. So, the wider context. I think first of all we have to recognize in Africa, as everywhere, educational failure or underachievement has multiple complex interacting causes, and language is only one of those. Teacher supply, material shortages, weak teacher morale, a huge rapid expansion towards universal primary education, exempting people from paying school fees has led to a very rapid expansion, and with that huge expansion there are bound to be problems of teacher education, teacher supply, and so on. Given that these problems are multiple and multifactorial, it's only going to lead to disappointment if we think that a change in language policy is sufficient. Maybe necessary, but it's not sufficient. Second point I want to make, which has been made various times by various people already, is that English is enormously attractive to elites and to the public. And this is reflected by the steady growth in private sector English medium education in South Africa, in India, in Tanzania, even in relatively poor countries where people find it difficult to afford the fees for private sector English medium education, they go for it, especially elites who talk one thing and do another when they send their children to private sector English medium education. What they're signaling is noted by the population. And I think the fact that in many countries there is a private sector alongside the state sector is often not sufficiently taken into account when looking at language policy. So basically there's a huge demand. Is this demand actually sensible or rational? I would argue that the demand for English is rational and completely understandable. Though I would add that the imagined benefits far exceed the actual benefits. Many people in Africa work in the informal economy, whether it's selling cigarettes from a packet on a street corner in Cairo Road, Lusaka, or whatever. A relatively small number of people work in the formal, kind of waged modern sector where English skills are more needed. So people imagine more than English can deliver. But imagination is hugely powerful, as we've seen. And people have talked about and shown that there is a real labor market advantage to having English skills for gaining entrance to the modern sector, waged employment in banks and offices and so on. And having lived, not visited, but lived in a remote town in western Zambia, Kauma for 5 years, I know that many parents are desperate, poor rural parents are desperate for their children to receive education with emphasis on rural skills, because they believe in part that these children will go to the town, get a salary job, and send back remittances to rural areas. And this plays an important role in the rural economy in places like Zambia or even Tanzania, for all I know. So English is not going to work for most people, but it is going to work for some, and it is perceived as a potential, and is actually a potential route out of poverty. To turn around and say, I'm sorry, you can't have so much English as you had before, will be very difficult politically and in many other ways. There's some patchy evidence also, which we've heard about with the Euromonitor talking about, this is talking about, I think when we talk about development and English, we can distinguish 3 important levels of analysis. What English does for the individual, some people would call that the private rates of return to English, the economists, is very different from what English does at the community level, where we're talking about a higher unit of analysis, and again, very different for what English does for society as a whole, the social rate of return. And here, people are talking about benefits, not in terms of individuals, but in terms of the benefits for the society, which is very different from the individual members of that society. At the society level, which as I said is very different, there's some evidence that English skills distributed in the population to a certain extent are associated with things like increased foreign investment, role in IT, tourism, etc. I think David Graddle has spoken about that in his book English Next in India. I think we already heard about the importance of remittances from places like Bangladesh, Zimbabwe, which are indirectly linked to skills in international languages like English, where we have a lot of Zimbabweans in this country, just even down the road a little bit, or from Bangladesh. So at the social level, we do see some potential patchy evidence of wide social benefits from a certain level of English skills. And hence, we have official discourses extolling the benefits, like in this statement from Tanzania. But let's look at the wider sociolinguistic context. When we talk about English and we talk about local languages, or indeed about language at all, we have to be very careful what we're talking about. Now, local languages, whatever that means, and it's still a kind of vague concept in my mind, exist in different forms. There is the standardized variety taught in schools. So, for example, standard Silozi exists somewhere out on the floodplain of the Zambezi River beside the King's Leonika's palace. But if you go to the town, Mungu, very different kind of Silozi is going on there. There, as somebody mentioned already, there's increased importance, which is recognized, of urban vernaculars in Africa, which are kind of a mixed bag. So you have street Swahili, town Bemba, town Nyanja, Isikamtho, street Setswana, a melange of different linguistic resources that people like Makoni and Mashiri have talked about. And this reminded me of somebody I knew many years ago, Robert Serpol from the University of Zambia, who was talking all those years ago about languages that are not discrete and autonomous systems as we tend to think in the West. They're not quite like that. They don't function like that in Africa. So we have to be a bit cautious about local languages and what varieties we're talking about. And even the political economy. I remember that when I worked in Western Zambia, I worked in a small town called Kaoma. In the colonial days, it was called Mankoya because the local language is Nkoya. It's spoken by 10 or 15,000 people. And it is within a province which is dominated by Silosi. But historically, the Silosi were the overlords of the Nkoya. So if you tell a local Kauma person, well, we want you to have Silosi as a medium of instruction, this local lingua franca, they won't be very happy about this. They say, well, we were ruled by Silosi people at one time. Why should we have their language? So the point beyond this local context is there are all kinds of local sensitivities and complexities that often get overlooked in talking about local languages in a sweeping way. Also, with English, I've already, how am I doing for time? I've still got 10 minutes or so, adding on a bit of extra. I think this is a crucial point about symbolic perceptions are hugely influential when talking about medium of instruction policy, top-down. Symbolic perceptions are hugely important in language policy, looking at it from the bottom up. As I've said, the standardized varieties of local African languages are often seen as lacking, by young people particularly, are seen as lacking this symbolic capital, indexing rural, highly ethnic, static, and so on. Town vernaculars, on the other hand, which have mixed origin, and in this context, by the way, maybe we shouldn't be playing with the concept of a language or languages so easily. Rather, semiotic resources. Along with English in comparison with these and the urban vernaculars are much cooler. They have social prestige, urban sophistication, upward mobility, and the middle class identities that pupils see enacted by their teachers. I want to be like, Ngoma there. He speaks English, he speaks Silosi, he does this and that. He is my role model. And if I do what he does, I'll be successful, and so on. Now, people have talked about changing attitudes and implementing new education policies. But education policies are rooted in people's perceptions and in their attitudes. And they're governed by what happens within the local economy. And it is quite difficult to overcome these quite entrenched attitudes that have been mentioned without actually changing the socio-economic and symbolic environment which give life to these attitudes. So what I'm saying is language policy in itself is relatively powerless. Language policies exist in an environment. To change the attitudes, to change the policy, you have to change the environment, which means changing the whole economy, which is hugely difficult. Okay. Quickly. Oh, only 5? Okay. Well, English too is not a clearly defined entity. People talk about English, we've talked about, but of course it's a plural thing. English is, and in Africa as elsewhere, there are many types of English. Indigenous varieties of English, standard English, African Englishes, pidgin vernacular Englishes, English is part of the urban landscape in the big cities like Lusaka. Even in smaller townships like I lived in, there was a shop, can you remember, which was called, had the name Try Again. So I came back every week to ask if they had some soap for sale. No, try again. So I think there was a slide earlier which said something like, English is not alien to Africa and these places. It should be treated in its own right as a kind of local language. Okay. So here's an aspect of local English. What we see here is Pidgin English in Nigeria. This is taken from Schneider's very good book on world Englishes. One other aspect which is sometimes forgotten about when talking about medium of instruction policies is that actually there's already a divergence between what is officially the medium and what is the de facto actual medium. A lot of talk in secondary schools and in primary schools departs from the official medium of instruction. It's characterized by bilingual mixed codes, where teachers switch backwards and forwards, talk in one language or parts of one language, deal with the book in another. So we have to think of the actual situation as being very much more complicated than there is English there, and what kind of English and so on. So I'm trying to evoke the notion of complexity in relation to these issues: sociolinguistic complexity, political and economic complexity, attitudinal complexity. All that said, all these things said, yes, English medium education imposes well understood social costs and is far from neutral socioeconomically, because of course it favors the better off, people who have easy access to it. There's a good case for democratizing access to English, which in some sense means more teaching of English rather than less. Highly controversial. English language education is often wasteful. Indeed, in many countries, I think it's practically pointless in primary education. Actually, people are not, the teachers, in the context of very rapidly expanding education, are not able to use or teach English. It's pointless, really. And a limited number of high-level jobs that actually demonstrably require English, as opposed to people imagining that they need it. So, what can be done? I speak for myself, for nobody else, and no other institution. But I do think that certain remedies I reject. Curtail English language education and replace English medium with a other medium, regional or local language medium, in upper primary and secondary school. Well, I think in primary school as a whole it could be done. Secondary school is much more problematic for a range of political, economic, and attitudinal reasons. We have to come back to this point about there being a private sector system existing alongside the state sector. And one result of this would intensify the drift or the flight of those who are able to the private sector, producing what Ramanathan has already talked about very eloquently in connection with India particularly, but it exists in other places, a so-called English vernacular divide. We have English medium schools alongside regional language medium schools. And because people go on to higher education in English, the people from English medium have a head start. It's also very difficult to control politically. The threat to aspirations creates political difficulties. And I've said that a certain proportion of the population with English skills will benefit society as a whole. I don't say all, but a certain proportion of the population. But saying who will get English and who will not is incredibly difficult. Secondly, some people will say, it's okay, don't worry, we can teach English as a subject, not use it as a medium. I think the evidence, such as it is, and there is not a huge amount of evidence, leads one to believe that over a period of time, this may lead to a lowering of English proficiency levels. We have seen in Europe the growth of CLIL as a way of enhancing largely people's skills in English. The drift is to more and more English medium instruction in the school level and the higher education level in Europe. The drift is towards dual or bilingual medium of instruction. And if we reflect on it, we can see that there are some people who learn a foreign language well when they study as a subject at school. But those people are bright. They're going to Oxford or somewhere later on. It's much more difficult to develop a language skill to a high level when you're just having 3 or 4 hours per week classes. So what can be done? I've argued this before. We want to get away from this either or, either local language or English. Concentrate the debate on how best to promote bilingual skills. We need both regional languages and local languages, whatever those local languages are, and I said that's already difficult. I do think there's a very strong case not for getting rid of English, but for delaying its introduction as a medium. And as I add there in the last sentence, the transition from one medium to another is vital. How it is managed will have an important impact on how well pupils are ready or able to access the curriculum through English. Flexibility in instructional policy. One size does not fit all for many African countries, especially the huge differences between urban and rural areas and the quality of the teachers. Many teachers in Africa are afraid to go and teach in rural areas, women especially. No electricity, lack of security, bad house, lack of marriage partners. Who am I going to meet when I'm living in Nkoya or wherever I am, Chitipa, Malawi? It's very limited. So there's a huge gulf, and that's reflected in the local sociolinguistic environment and teachers. And this is what I heard Pauline Ray Dickens argue for in the previous conference. She's sitting over there, sort of grinning at me a little bit, or maybe not. Flexible use of multiple languages in assessment, I think, is very sensible. This is one of my, I've been in a bonnet about this, I've written about it before. Greater acknowledgement of code switching, flexible bilingualing, languaging between two languages in class is horrible to some people, but I think the bulk of the evidence shows it can actually be very, very beneficial. It's what teachers do anyway. Okay, time is running out. Greater efforts to educate parents and officials of the advantages of bilingual education. An example is given by Linehan talking about Zambia. But the whole issue is very difficult. I used to say to people in my little town in Zambia, well, why don't you use the local language? Or say, what do you know, white man? You have everything, and we have nothing. So why should we pay attention to what you're saying? We know best what our children need. So, yes, we have to persuade parents, but we have to do it carefully. Understand the limits of education policy above all. Avoid a linguocentric fallacy. because we're all involved in language, we try to think of language as hugely important. But it's only one amongst a whole range of factors. Incremental improvement, these things will help. Plus, sensible, feasible, realistic to the context language education policies that are highly flexible, locally meaningful. We cannot afford to go on generalizing about language and development as if it's the same everywhere, let alone within one country. So there are very difficult issues, a lot of complexity that I hope I have left you with is the whole idea that this is a complex area. Thank you.